Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 8th webinar now in this Civic Commons Catalyst series. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that this series is part of our Future Cities Canada program here at Evergreen. And that is something that offers a pretty big variety of programming, and we try to support already existing initiatives, as well as try out new participatory models. And all of this, of course, is grounded in resident-led activities. And on the next slide, we're just gonna overview what we interpret the Civic Commons to be, which you'll hear more of this from one of our speakers, Ajiv, but it really is sort of a backbone of a city. And these look totally different to different communities in which industries they're emerging from. But at the end of the day, they respond to the needs of the residents themselves, and they offer public benefits, and they're meant to foster engagement, equity, and ultimately prosperity within the cities. And just actually a quick note on that point, we've been hosting this webinar series for several months now. And this today is by far the most amount of registrants we've ever had, which really captures, I think, just how important social infrastructure is in this particular time we're at. So on our next slide, I'd love to introduce the speakers that we have today. We are joined by Ajiv Bhatia and Orit Sarfati as we discuss, as you know, the resiliency that community hubs inherently support within their communities. This is more particular to our conversation before, during, and after crises. I'll be your host and your moderator today. My name is Molly Freems. I'm a program officer here at Evergreen, and I'm joined by my dream team, Jasmine Lefren, who is supporting all of the tech and logistics behind the scenes, and Ayana Webb, who will be supporting with the discussion at the end, and is really the brain behind this entire program. We as a team have come up today with a few more participatory elements than we usually use in a webinar. So bear with us, we're trying some new technology and we hope it all goes through smoothly. But to that point, Ayana has just shared Jasmine's email, so you can contact her directly if you're having any tech issues. And of course, you can also add in the chat box if you have any tech issues. I'm just gonna briefly go over the time that we have together and then we'll dive right in. So I'll be taking a few minutes to set the stage a little bit. I'm then going to hand it over to Ajiv first and then to Orit to give their quick presentations. We're gonna have some polls throughout, so you'll get a chance to participate. And then we'll have a plenary Q&A. For folks who signed up last minute, this officially ends at about 1, but because of the feedback we've received of folks really wanting to lean into connection throughout this webinar and afterwards, we've added an additional half hour from 1 to 1:30 for an optional breakout moderated discussion to sort of like dive into some juicier information. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the next slide. I think in a digital context, it sometimes escapes us to acknowledge the land from which we're calling in from. But we're all patching in from territories and land that are really rich in history, as a borderless map like this might show. So on the next slide, we have tried creating an option where people can participate in this. So using the chat box, please type in the number that corresponds with the territory from where you're calling in. It's obviously not exhaustive, so please add wherever you might be calling in from. If you want to add it in a different language, please do. I see a lot of people calling in from Dish with One Spoon territory, where a lot of the Evergreen folks are coming in from as well. The traditional homelands of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe confederacies. A couple from the north, from the west. This is really interesting. That's great. Yeah, I think today it's of particular importance to acknowledge and really learn from the teachings and ways of knowing and living with all of our relations that are so intrinsic to traditional cultures all around the globe. And I'm sure through Ajeev and Orit's conversations that that's going to ground what we're talking about when we center it around community care and resilience. Great. Ayana has also just shared in the chat box the, what am I trying to say? Hyperlinks for whos.land and nativeland.ca, which are really great resources for anybody who wants to check it out after this call. Okay, on the next slide, we're also going to do another participatory activity, and that's a bit of a check-in. So just like in the previous slide, try adding the number that corresponds to which graphic best describes how you're feeling right now. We got some feedback that we want this conversation to be centered around maintaining that social connectivity in a time of physical distancing, which is really important. So we'll have this at the end as well to check in with how people are doing. I've seen a lot of thumbs. I've seen a couple of shrugs. I'm going to try to just describe the emoji and not what I interpret what the feeling might be behind it. Yeah, a couple of fists in the air. That's great. I'm feeling a bit of a number 8 alien myself these days, feeling like I have less awareness of who I am and what I'm doing. Okay, that's super helpful. We are going to complement this sort of check-in and this human-centric approach with some suggested suggested group norms in our next slide. So we fully understand that work these days comes with a really different kind of vibe. So this is only where possible and are just as suggestions. But in order to kind of try the model of bringing in the same sort of social cues that we might give to one another in an in-person context, try turning your webcams on. Sound will be added for participants if you're called on for a question, and then in the last half hour for discussion. Do whatever you can to remain present. It might be hard. There's, you know, a world of distractions out there. And we're totally understanding to what people are dealing with around them right now. But if that can involve putting a phone away, try that. We've got lots of pieces for engagement. So use the chat box function. We're gonna have a Q&A session. We're gonna have some polls, which are gonna be fun if they work. And the last suggestion, if you're looking to connect with others before, well, I guess not before, during or after this call, one of the suggestions that we thought of was changing your Zoom name to your email address. So on the next slide, we have the option instructions that if you go to the bottom toolbar, you can click on participants and hover over your name, and a little blue rename button should pop up. And again, you can reach out if you're having tech issues. That's an option. You could leave it exactly as it is right now, or you could add a name and pronoun if you like, which if you do, I would just ask that folks, if you're referring to one another, you respect the pronoun that has been added onto somebody's name. Okay, so with all of that sort of intro under the way, we're gonna try our first poll right now. So the slide captures the poll itself, but Zoom has an actual poll function. So you should have just received a pop-up that asks the question about main challenges rather that you're facing right now. And I can see them in live time. So I'm seeing people respond to modifications, supporting residents has been challenging, a lot of sort of ongoing program changes. That seems to be the most popular right now. Definitely financial insecurity and that sort of sense of instability. I'm gonna leave it up for maybe 2 more seconds. And then I'm going to end the poll, and the results should be able to be shared to the audience. And if not, I'll let you know what it says. Okay, Fingers crossed. So while we're waiting for this to work, on my end, at 55%, most of you responded that modifying ongoing programming is definitely a challenge right now. At 40%, financial insecurity and business planning, of course. And at 32%, supporting residents. The last one, a couple of folks shared on the chat box, so I just want to make sure that I'm including that as well. Yeah, that's mainly for folks who were adding if they couldn't participate in the poll and pivoting the business model, and certainly all of the above, because definitely hard to choose right now. Okay, at this point, I'm going to stop talking, rather. I am going to introduce our first speaker, Ajiv Bhatia. Ajiv has been a great partner with Evergreen for as long as I've been here. He's the manager over at C3, Center for Connected Communities, and has a pretty, how do I describe this? A great mind for bringing communities together in a way that is both community-led and centric to that place from where they're coming, and also very heart-led. So with that, Ajiv, I'll pass it on to you, and your presentation will start now.
Heart-led, that's very beautiful. Thank you, Molly. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us during your lunch hour. I heard there's a lot of really cool webinars happening right now, so super grateful that you chose to be with us. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about the connected community approach to neighborhood resilience. So this is a community development approach to resilience planning. So it's about collective and community-wide, as opposed to being individual. And I'm going to walk us through a few things. I'm going to talk about what connected community approach is really quickly and what neighborhood resilience is. I'm going to try and define things as much as I can. I know there's a lot of definitions that circulate. So for our context, I'll try and help to root us. I'm going to talk about the stages of resilience within this framework of neighborhood resilience, and what it looks like for community hubs within this framework. And then try to get to some of the stages, but if we run out of time, I have a backup plan. So next slide, please. So the connected community approach is really, at its core, it's a set of principles and practices that support authentic and meaningful connection of people and communities who want to make a positive impact. And so it's a community development approach, and it's rooted in 2 decades of the work of the East Scarborough Storefront. And that's a community backbone organization in an inner city suburb in Scarborough in Toronto. And the neighborhood resilience kind of definition, there's tons of definitions going out there around the language of resilience. For neighborhood resilience, what we're talking about is really the capacity of community groups, networks, and organizations to collectively and effectively prepare for, respond to, recover from, regroup, and bounce forward after a shock. So shocks can, in some contexts just mean climate related. This is an approach that thinks of shocks as quite general, and so it can also be neighborhood violence, and in this case, for our context, the pandemic. And this approach really recognizes several key principles. Some core pieces I want to focus on really quickly is that good community development tells us that place-based solutions are what are effective on the ground. And so it really, really honors local context, which means that it will look different in different neighborhoods. It recognizes that marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted by shocks, and actually shocks pull back the curtains of inequities that we see in our cities. And so, if we're gonna start doing neighborhood resilience planning, let's start in marginalized communities and start investing in strategies there. It recognizes that neighborhoods are ecosystems. So ecosystems are these interconnected, complex systems. And similar to a rainforest, for example, a neighborhood has so much going on and so much that's interconnected. And so when we're working in neighborhoods, we have to remember that we're part of a bigger system, and that interventions that we catalyze will have implications on that neighborhood system. And finally, it recognizes that grassroots groups, community-based organizations, institutions, and governments, they all have a role to play in resilience and in responding to and all of the other stages in resilience. And that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And really what this framework is about is how can we best connect those different parts so that everybody who has a role to play is playing it in a coordinated and strategic way. So next slide, please. We've been doing a little bit of this work for about 1.5 years to 2 years, and we've been doing some research with researchers at the University of Toronto, Dal Lana School of Public Health, and really looking at the literature to examine kind of what is, what is the literature saying around community-based resilience. And the kind of preliminary big, super simplified, one of the kind of findings is that the literature is saying that there needs to be a greater systemic kind of collaboration between residents, grassroots, and government systems. And it kind of stops short of telling us how, what it actually looks like, because it does get quite messy when we're talking about implementation. So what we're working on at the moment also is a pilot project in a few neighborhoods in Toronto's neighborhood improvement areas, with the City of Toronto to roll this prototype of an approach out. Next slide, please. So we're here to talk about hubs and hubs in the context of resilience. So I want to spend the remainder of the time talking about that. But first I'm going to back up and try and define for us what we think a hub is, because just like resilience, there's a lot of different ways to think about the word hub. So within the context of the connected community approach and neighborhood resilience, hubs aren't bricks and mortar. They're not the physical space, facility, building where people gather. And another way to think about it is that it's the function that follows, form follows the function. And so when we think about hubs, we think about them as community backbone organizations. And so the functions of a community backbone organization in the context of neighborhood resilience is that they are network weavers. So they weave networks across communities. They are communicators. They translate knowledge across sectors. So from the grassroots to system level folks, they're translating knowledge. They're champions of grassroots work and grassroots initiatives that are happening hyper locally, and they bring them to the surface. And they're liaisons. They're the function and the role that they play is to support coordination between emergency response and community-wide strategies. So when we think about hubs as a function of community backbone organizations, the form of a hub can take on many different looks. So it can be a faith-based hub, right? It can be a local grassroots group that for a long time has been organizing in a community. It can be a social service agency that offers services into a neighborhood, right? So the functions can take on different forms. And I think that's really important to emphasize. The one thing is that, this is an approach that requires investment in people and time, right? And so we typically see hubs who have bigger operational costs associated with their work, but also the funds to do that, having a staff member take on some of this work. But really, if we want to do it right, we need deep investment in communities over a long term. And so the diagram that you're looking at here on your screen is what the role of a community backbone organization in the context of neighborhood resilience can look like. Right, and so here we see we have a community backbone organization in kind of the center here, and it is this rippling connection between service response, right? So when shocks occur in neighborhoods, social service agencies from across cities can come into neighborhoods, and so, but it's really important that they are connected to the people who need access to those services and folks who are already in the community. And so community hubs can play that, community backbone organizations can play that role to connect social service agencies to people in a neighborhood. Similarly to emergency response, community backbone organizations can connect and help emergency responders understand local contexts of neighborhoods. That's so important. They also have an understanding, because of their deep trust relationships and networks in the community, they are able to recognize what's typically very informal and very invisible in grassroots activities that are critical to supporting resilience efforts in neighborhoods that are usually overlooked. And so community backbone organizations, because they're place-based, are able to surface the work of grassroots groups and bring it to the center of resilience strategies. And community backbone organizations are able to connect with city staff who have resources, who have expertise, and ensure that they are conduits of that resource and expertise to community. Otherwise, these different actors are going to be operating on their, in the ways that they know best how to, but they won't necessarily be connected in the most effective and efficient way. So this is kind of how we see, in a very simplified and kind of broad sense, the role of a community organization in neighborhood resilience. Next slide, please. And so I know my time is kind of coming to an end. What I do want to share with you, and I will include it in a follow-up document that you all have access to, is a one-pager that we put together on what we think this neighborhood-based, community-based resilience strategy looks like on the ground, with some bullet points kind of describing some of the key objectives for each strategy. And so from prepare for, respond to, recover from, regroup, and bounce forward, one of the little circles that are missing in the slide that you're looking at is invest. And after prepare, we need to invest in neighborhood strategies, because building relationships over time and ensuring that networks are being weaved in communities is a complex role. And we need to be doing it before shocks actually occur, so that when they do occur, we are prepared, neighborhoods are prepared to be able to respond. And so that investment's really key. So I will invite you all to take a look at that one pager when you do get it in your inbox, and think about your role as a group, as an organization, as an institution within those stages of resilience, and what you can be doing in each one of those stages, because we're all a part of an ecosystem. In this case, it's a hyperlocal neighborhood base, but it's also citywide. And so it's important to reflect on how we are contributing to that ecosystem to support resilience. So I'm gonna stop there. I tried to keep it as broad as I could, explaining core concepts, and I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. So I'm hoping that we can discuss them some more, but I also invite you to connect with me on Twitter, on my email, and I'm always open to pick up the phone and chat. I also really know that this is one emergent approach to what can be a plethora of different approaches to resilience planning. And so we want to learn also about what others are doing. So please do reach out, and I'd love to learn more from you all. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ajeev. It's your last mention of emergence is so grounding. If anybody has not read Emergent Strategy from Adrienne Marbree Brown, as one of many leaders in this field, I very much recommend it as a strategy to be building into community building. So what Ajeev is bringing up is a great opportunity for us to check in with our participants again with another poll. So we're going to try this poll option again and check in of what do we think are the main role of the community hubs at a time like this. So hopefully the poll will have showed up on your screen, and I'm already receiving a ton of responses. Holy, you guys are fast. Okay, so a lot about planning towards post-resilience, a lot about supporting residents, of course. I'm going to check my chat box here to see what is coming through. Where'd it go? A lot of all of the aboves. Hear that. Okay, great. At this point, let's share the results. Oh, I like that last one that was added about continuing to foster community and social connection during this time. So as you can see, a big leaning actually, well, actually a pretty even split. So supporting residents, of course, always as our core function, followed by the post-COVID planning. And then, yeah, that groundedness and social connection. That's great. And thank you for Blake, who shared the book just mentioned, Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. It is wonderful. Okay, so with the next slide, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Orit is our Chief Program Officer here at Evergreen, who holds really beautifully this tension between leading the direction and the oversight of our programming here, but also coming from real intentionality of just wanting to get her hands dirty and paint benches herself one day, as she described it to me. She comes to us from Tides, did a lot of work all across the states, and notably on a big cultural plan for City of Chicago. So we're very lucky to have Orit with us today. And with that, I'll pass it on to you.
Molly, thank you, and thanks to all of you who are joining us here today. This is really exciting and will hopefully be the beginning of a longer conversation. Well, it's my privilege every day to have this role and to get to work at Evergreen. What you're looking at the screen is, I guess, a drone shot probably of the Evergreen Brickworks campus. For those of you who haven't visited us, well, you can't visit now, but you could visit us hopefully in the fall. We're located right in the heart of the Don River Valley. We're open 365 days a year, and we welcome about 500,000 visitors to our site. If you could look just over yonder beyond the physical site, you see this tremendous and glorious nature. And so not only are we the site for summer camps and for weddings and conferences and festivals, a farmer market and restaurants, but we're also the gateway to exploring the tremendous ravines that Toronto has. So we serve as a site in itself in terms of place, but then hopefully as inspiration for people to get outdoors and explore cities for all of what cities are. Over to the next slide. You see, I guess another drone picture. When did this happen? So we, in the midst of these few weeks, well, this has been the first time in 10 years that we have closed the site. And for someone like me who lives for people to come onto the site and discover the layers of what Brickworks is and discover something about themselves. In some respects, it's been heartbreaking, because if you're a chief program officer and you don't have a place to program, well, what the heck are you going to do? But in another respect, it's actually been one of the most illuminating times to be a programmer, particularly of a physical site. And that's what I want to describe today for all of you who are looking at your organizations or your situation. This is an opportunity to really distill down to some core elements, you know, what you're encouraged to do when you put a strategic plan together, or when you launch a new program. You're encouraged to know what your audience is, what the goal is, what are your agendas. And when you are immersed in a three-dimensional site, it's really hard to do, and it takes so much more discipline than what I have. And this has forced us to take a really, really big step back and to look at some fundamentals, to look at our mission, to look at our audience. So this is kind of a blessing in disguise. We've gone back to our basics and our mission, which is to enable flourishing cities. Well, what does that mean when a core component of our delivery service is not there? And we've looked at our values, and those are sustainability and connection and innovation. Okay, well, maybe we take it for granted that having a reconfigured former brick making factory that is now this flourishing gathering space, well, that's I've been able to check off connection right there, and I've been able to check off innovation pretty easily. But maybe this is challenging us in a way that we may never have challenged ourselves otherwise. So over the next several slides, I want to share with you some of the ingenuity and creativity that the entire Evergreen staff has come together in a speedy, light speed sort of way in response to who our audience is and what our mission is. And so I want to talk about our visiting schools programs and our labs and our farmers markets. And I'll describe what those are, but then also as an illustration, describe how we've transitioned it into a reality where we can't use the physical site as our way of creating community. The questions that we've asked are, what experiences can we replicate for our community through alternative formats? And it's not simply putting a camera in front of a face, but to really think about what sort of experiences and learnings do we want people to have when we know that we can't see each other in 3 dimensions. And then we want to really acknowledge what experience we can't replicate, what can't be transferred in any other way. And let's acknowledge that we host hundreds of weddings every year, and we are not going to pretend that a virtual wedding is anywhere close to the sort of acknowledgement and bearing witness and celebration that can only take place in person. So I think that's important too. What about place and what about placemaking is intrinsically physical? And what are some of those elements that can be deconstructed to allow for community gathering, maybe in a more enriched way, to allow for universal accessibility in many ways that a situation like this offers. So I want to talk to you about the farmers market. And another slide would be super helpful in doing it. Thank you. So our farmers market has actually been around even before Evergreen Brickworks was founded. So it actually kind of presaged this community gathering place and confirmed that people are actually willing to come down to the Don River Valley. Every Saturday, hundreds and hundreds of people descend down to the farmers market and make it their weekly ritual to buy what's local, to have conversations with neighbors and friends, to stick around and have a picnic. It's more than a couple of stalls. Evergreen Brickworks Farmers Market is one of the most popular farmers market in the city of Toronto, but it's a way of putting a face to food systems and food sustainability. And so that's not available to us now. So we've asked ourselves, well, how do we take a bustling market and transpose it into a model that still supports our farmers, that it supports our staff, and helps our local food system. So we've come up with a farm in a box. Originally it was farmer in a box, but people were afraid that that kind of looked like a farmer in a coffin, so we did not want that. So we came up with farm in a box, which I think is fantastic. It was based on a few really important, tangible elements that, again, I'm quite sure we wouldn't have thought of if we had the benefit of the flourishing farmers market at our disposal. And those are a really close relationship with farmers. The moment that we closed down our site, we were in touch with farmers immediately, and we have this decades-long relationship with them, and we understood what their needs are. We understood what produce they were still able to offer, and they trusted us enough to know that we would be able to support them in their livelihood. Being able to then offer a farm in a box was something that was that took shape in the matter of 48 hours because of our relationship with existing farmers. And what is Farm in a Box? Well, we are working with between 8 and 10 vendors a week to collect the produce that are sprouting in their farms into bags that will be enough to support a family of 4 for 2 like really great dinners, using all the precautions and social distancing restrictions that will all keep us safe. People pre-sign and prepay on our website, and then they come at designated times on Saturday to pick up their bags. We wanted to honor the fact that a farmer's market is a weekly ritual. And so, one component that was really important in putting this together was allowing people to sign up for a Farm in a Box for many weeks at a time. And we also knew that farmers are wanting to connect with their regular customers and also allow for new people to discover them. So we are working with a kind of a roundtable of farmers to be able to distribute this service to as many farmers as we can. And then we realized that even though sites are closed, well, chickens are still laying their eggs. So supporting food systems through Farm in a Box was really important. And as I'm reading down, and I'm finding it really hard to concentrate because of all the noise, and thank you so much for that. Yeah, we sold out. We sold out in a matter of 24 hours, and we're continuing to scale up from the first initial batch and offering this for at least a matter of 2 months. Let's go over to the next slide. And what I want to talk about is another service, another program that we offer, which is the kind of knowledge sharing that Evergreen conducts in the space of large gatherings on site, but also programs across the country that really support city building. And during this time, my staff really looked inwards in thinking, how do we continue our leadership in innovation and breaking down silos in city building, particularly for the purposes of resilience. And the photo that you're looking at is the morning of the Future Cities Canada Summit, which will be held this October, but has been held over the past 2 years as well, that purposely brings together organizations and individuals across sectors with the acknowledgement that the hairy, complex city issues that are in front of us can't be solved when we're navel gazing. It has to be solved through multi-sectoral communication and discovery and solutions building. And that's the basis for our summit and the basis for much of the convening work that we hold across the country. The solution labs that we facilitate in housing, for instance, hopes to link best practices and research and solutions across cities so that we can grow together. And so when we were thinking about the COVID-19 reality, for this particular component of our programming, a virtual component was kind of intuitive. But again, it wasn't simply putting a camera in the midst of a meeting. It was about honing in on a very focused goal to really identify what the roles are for every person around the room, and acknowledging that now more than ever, convening itself cannot be the end. They cannot be the purpose of what Evergreen hopes to contribute. Meetings need to translate into action, whether that is policy change for responding to unemployment, homelessness, ways of looking at food systems and supply chains during this time. The number of invitations that we're all receiving to convene virtually makes it really difficult to prioritize. The one benefit of coming together physically is that when you're one place, you're by nature not in any other place. And that kind of oftentimes prioritizes the people around the room that you're in over everything else. Virtually, we can all toggle, and we all do toggle from one reality to another, from one virtual world to another. And so more so now than ever, we've really taken a hard look at what we are doing and the kind of information we're trying to communicate and take back, and ask ourselves, okay, in the midst of 1,000 other options, is this relevant? And will this have impact? And I could tell you that we have never been forced to have that kind of discipline in the information and convening role that Evergreen has had. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the kind of discipline that these constrictions have forced us to have. I mean, painters often say that they're most creative when there are parameters around their work. And I think that that's definitely the case for traditionally place-based organization like Evergreen. So the webinar that we are all participating in is, I think, a really great example. Really thinking about what is most relevant in our time now, has positioned the content into the current reality, the sort of interaction that Molly and others have incorporated into this, has thought very critically about the need for two-way dialogue. And hopefully in the second half of this meeting, we will have an opportunity to engage in smaller groups. The way that we're engaging and convening has been enriched and in fact has shown to be quite relevant in this new format. And so over to the last example and the next slide, which is, no, not that slide. Yeah, that slide. Yeah, thank you. What you're looking at here is the ravine systems right behind our site. And it is actually as beautiful as you see it in this picture year round. It's just, I'm getting very sad that I'm not there. 12,000 school kids come to our site as part of our visiting school program, and kids get to go outdoors. They learn immersively. There's a kind of education that's tangible. Kids stick their hands in dirt and learn about plants and growth, and they learn the different names of trees. And for many kids, this is really their only opportunity to experience nature. And we are so proud to be able to offer that year round. The kind of discovery of nature through play is what so much of our outdoor educators are passionate about, and it seeps through to so many kids who treasure that opportunity. So what do we do now? Well, so we are in the process of launching a couple of programs. You're going to see a pattern here because we're calling it Evergreen in a Box. With the site closed, the nature-based learning that Evergreen has offered to visiting school programs will be converted to give parents and kids the opportunity to celebrate the coming spring with a box that includes ready to grow seeds, very easy to use manual for how to make your balcony or your backyard your own garden. And we are also pairing budding gardeners with our outdoor educators online to introduce concepts of plant growth through interactive demonstrations with our gardeners. And then we'll also be introducing worm kits for families for that tangible education and discovery. This way kids can raise their own worms. They could learn about horticulture in the process. And in many respects, really be able to have that type of discovery through nature that we're really excited about. So moving over to the next slide. We've been able to do this through the agility of our staff leadership, through constant communication with our community. We've been polling and having continuous dialogue with people that are so passionate about our site, and through trial and error, where mistakes and failures are part of the game. And we're grateful to our community for giving us that generosity to experiment and to fail gloriously in service of a better community. Over to the next slide. I do want to say that what I'm discovering is that as nimble as we are, there is no substitute for place. And I say that shamelessly. For a physical place, for the serendipity that comes with experiencing things that you never anticipated before, for the spontaneity that comes with a three-dimensional immersive experience. There's an acknowledgement when you're in a place that you can't curate your space like maybe you can do on your screen, and that will lead to an unexpected interaction. And it is kind of a celebration of diversity and experience, and that's glorious. Coming together in a place is an endorsement of civil society. Again, just choosing, because we can't be in more than one place at one time, choosing to be at a place that welcomes all says that this is really important, and we acknowledge it. So when we get back to the stream of things, one policy that I hope we see strengthened is the support, the municipal support and the community support of community gathering places, Evergreen among them. And then over to the last slide. When we're back on site, I think that there's no doubt that there's going to be a blending of the virtues of a virtual world with that of place. What we're seeing is that our In a Box series is growing our community of people who, for many reasons, just can't make it onto our site. A virtual world allows for people to come together in richer and deeper ways with the utmost of accessibility, and it's something that we want to incorporate once we're back on site. And then finally, the last slide. I think that this is a moment to take stock of what communities are telling us that we mean to them. We're barreling toward a future of uncertainty with, in some respects, wide open possibilities, but in others, certain parameters that we can't change. And so at the same time that we are determining what we can't replicate, we are finding out how very important it is to innovate, to experiment, to be so transparent as to understand what the needs of our community are, and to focus. So those are lessons that will strengthen our organizations, and hopefully will strengthen all of everyone's experience within your own work life. What is our goal? Who are we trying to communicate, and what is the best way, the most optimal way to have impact? I think that I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you, Arit. In that presentation, Arit raised a lot of really great examples of shifting and pivoting. So in this next slide, we've got our second to last poll, which is to check in with all of you and your organizations. How are you all adapting to these pressures? So the poll should have opened up again for folks to participate. And again, it's just the same sort of idea. Are we shifting place-based online, which Arit really highlighted? It's both potential and challenge. Are we having to close temporarily? Are we adding things? Lots of people are responding to business as usual. That's interesting too. Some scaling back, of course, downsizing. And I'm gonna check our chat poll here to see if there are some text versions. Not yet, okay. Okay, so I'll give it a few more seconds. And then let's end and share the poll now. And yes, as folks can see, a lot of this is moving online. So it'll be really important to see how webinars like this and how knowledge sharing and gathering can overcome those challenges that Arit highlighted and achieve earlier, especially in different formats that some of us may not be as used to. So let's switch to the last slide here. We're going to shift over now to some Q&A. The way that we're going to do this is using the raise hand function on Zoom as well as the chat box. So what we're going to do on the next slide, there's instructions for how to use that raise hand. If you go to the participants, you should have a little hand symbol that will help raise things. I'm going to start off with the first question, and then I'll switch to moderating those hands as well as questions that you can type into the chat box. We're going to leave this slide up so that the instructions are still available for the next couple of minutes, and then we'll wrap up. So first off the bat, neither of you spoke about this in great detail, and it came up a little bit in the Twitter chat that we had earlier this week that some of the participants on this call participated in. So I want to bring it back because you both touched on it slightly but didn't dive in. There's a lot of talk, I think, of going back to quote unquote normal. But part of why community hubs are so vital is because normal isn't working. So I'm curious what you've been hearing from your communities throughout the past few weeks on how we as hubs can be supporting a resurgence of normal, and perhaps that's not even the right word to use, that's truly resilient. And Ajeev, maybe I'll throw it to you first and then you can pass it to Arit. And fair warning, I did not give this question in advance to my speakers.
Thank you. It's an excellent question. I don't know if we're going to return to a normal. I think there will be a new normal. I think we have to face the reality that people's lives are being extremely disrupted and being devastatedly destroyed, losing incomes, losing access to the kind of essential services and needs to get by. April 1st. Yesterday was a tough day for a lot of people, right? Rent was due, mortgages were due, but mostly for folks who, have to pay rent, who are in a position where they can't afford to stock up on food. There are all sorts of reasons why this is devastating for a lot of people. And so I think it's important to recognize that then a new normal will have to be a new normal that centers equity, right? If we want to talk about resilient futures, we need to have equitable futures. There's no resilient future without having an equitable one. And in order to be able to do that effectively, we need to look towards communities strategically to surface solutions that they identify, but also not give up on the fact that we have just remarkable public service with expertise and resources that they have, that is available to them. They have an incredible role to play, along with social service agencies as well. And so, you know, I think we all have a role in the solution. I think it requires complex facilitation to get the right folks together in neighborhoods, right? I think solutions should start there. And I think we need to be centering and surfacing the voices of grassroots groups with equity lenses to be leading those discussions, and then looking towards folks with resources, positions of power, to say, how can we leverage our work that we want to do, our goals, to strategically advance all of our agendas together. So I don't know if there is a normal. I think there is a new normal, and I hope that that new normal is an equitable future.
Yeah, I think you really landed on the equity part there as such a key point to this, and what is really at the heart of a lot of community hubs on this call. I want to hand the reins over to Andrew, who has raised their hand, and just make sure that we have a little bit more participation like we promised. So Andrew, I'm going to unmute you so that you can ask your question now. Andrew, if you're able to, you could ask your question. If not, we could go ahead to a next one.
Sure. The question I have is if there is some way of disseminating there's 109 people on board. My problem right now, which is terrifying me, is I design traditional neighborhoods which rely on public spaces to unite the whole community. And I am at a loss because all of a sudden, the whole idea of having the trade-off of living in a smaller space, you don't have as much privacy or private space. And yet just outside your door, there's an incredible array of amenities in the way of public spaces and a range of public spaces and streets and piazzas and parks and plazas. But the whole thing is based on gathering people together. And I'm scrambling, trying to look at precedents where people are addressing it. So this discussion has helped. And as I said, caveat, missed the first 20 minutes. So if you can somehow perhaps mass mail how you, if there are comments that come in, to put them in a, not just, I don't know if you're making this webinar as part of a PDF or somehow a presentation, but if you can also, if people have comments regarding that, or call me or email me, because I'm 20 years of working on traditional neighborhood developments. We have 3 projects which are 1,600 homes, and the very basis of that is being brought into question by people calling density the enemy these days. So any clarity or help on that is some of the things that have been brought up would be great, but if anybody has anything further, it would be much appreciated to be posted somehow.
That's a great question. I think because it's so broad, why don't we use that as one of our prompts for the discussion group for folks who are going to join us for the next half hour. So at this point, just to respect people's time, I'm going to ask Jasmine to go to the next slide. And we're going to do one final poll. A reminder for people who do want to continue this conversation, we have a whole half hour blocked off for it from 1 till 1:30. But for our last poll, we want to check in. We've spent an hour together. What are people feeling like we need? Andrew raised some really good points, and how are we going to connect moving forward and continue to support each other? And on my side, I'm getting some support for ongoing touch points, which is great, and community of practice, which comes as no surprise since so many of us embed that in the work that we do, as well as advocacy and interesting sort of matching advocacy and partners. Okay, at this point, why don't we share the poll and everybody can get an example, a little taste. So this one's less balanced than other polls, certainly an emphasis on support and networks that are building each other up. And so perhaps it looks like something like another webinar or a little mini series. as we move through, as Reet referred to, the many phases of this current crisis, and the now, and once we get back on site and post. So let's wrap up at this point. For those who have to leave us at 1, we're going to close this poll and move to the next slide. We just want to do a little checkout again, just to thank you for spending your time with us, and in the chat box, maybe take a minute to reflect on how you're feeling as you're exiting, the same way that we checked in together. Seeing some thumbs up, seeing some fingers crossed. That's interesting. I'm a terrible millennial. I never knew if the 2 hands like this was a high five or if it was like a prayer motion. So take that as you will. And that's great. At this point on the next slide, we do have another webinar coming up on the 28th. You will receive an info email after this, thanking you for participating. And with more info on that, it's going to be based on faith-based community hubs and now how they are also being affected by COVID and all of the changes around us. So thank you so much, Ajiv and Orit. Thank you so much for our very willing participants to go on this experiment with us. And to Ayanna and Jasmine, my great team. And enjoy the rest of your Thursdays.